The wind came at Margaret Lindholm's cabin from 3 directions at once, and she knew what that meant. February in Dakota Territory, 1881, and the sky had gone the color of old pewter. She stood in her doorway watching the horizon disappear into itself. Her nearest neighbor lived 4 miles east. The town of Pembina sat 17 miles south. And her firewood bunker, the one every homesteader within 20 miles had called a waste of good lumber, sat 32 feet from her door, built half into the earth like a root cellar that had lost its way. She'd built it in September for $7.40. Used what the railroad surveyors had left behind, plus cottonwood logs she'd dragged from the riverbank herself. Everyone said she was doing it wrong. The temperature stood at 8 degrees above zero that morning. By noon, it'd be 20 below. By nightfall, the kind of cold that made seasoned frontiersmen respect their mortality. Margaret Lindholm had arrived in Pembina County in spring 1879, a Swedish immigrant widow with a land claim nobody else wanted. The quarter section sat in a shallow basin where the Tongue River made a lazy bend. The land office clerk had smiled when she filed her claim. "Ma'am, that particular 160 acres has defeated 3 separate families in the past 6 years." She'd nodded, paid her $14 filing fee, and walked back to her wagon. Her first summer went to building a soddy with walls 2 feet thick. By August, she had 4 walls, a roof of cottonwood poles covered with sod, 1 door and 1 window with real glass salvaged from an abandoned claim shack. The interior measured 14 feet by 16 feet. The whole structure had cost less than $30. But it was the Firewood bunker, built the following September, that got people talking. Thomas Granholm ran the general store in Pembina and had been in Dakota Territory since 1867. He'd survived the blizzard of '73 that killed 11 people in his county alone, and he knew winter. When Margaret came into his store in early September to buy nails and hinges, he asked what she was building. "Storage for firewood," she said, "half underground near the cabin." He set down the nail keg he'd been moving. "Ma'am, firewood goes in a woodshed. 4 posts, a roof, maybe walls on 3 sides if you're ambitious. What you're describing sounds like you're digging a grave for cordwood." She'd smiled, a small expression that didn't reach her eyes. "In Sweden, my grandfather built storage cellars for everything. Potatoes, grain, even firewood for the smithy. Kept things dry, kept them from freezing too hard, kept them accessible when the snow piled to the roofline." Granholm shook his head. "This ain't Sweden, ma'am. This is Dakota. Different kind of winter." But he sold her the nails anyway. 40-penny spikes, 6 pounds of them, for 60 cents. James Mackenzie, a Scots-Irish homesteader who'd been in the basin for 4 years, stopped by her claim in mid-September to watch her dig. He was a compact man with a beard the color of rust, known throughout the county as someone who could coax wheat from land that barely supported grass. He sat on his horse for 10 minutes, watching her work the pickaxe into the half-frozen earth before he spoke. "Mrs. Lindholm, I mean no disrespect, but I've seen folks waste labor before, and what you're doing there qualifies." She paused, wiped sweat from her forehead with her sleeve. The temperature stood at 43 degrees, unseasonably cold for September. "You think it's waste?" "I know it's waste," Mackenzie said. "You're putting a structure half below grade in land that freezes 5 feet down come January. Moisture's going to seep in from every direction. Your firewood'll rot before Christmas, or it'll freeze into one solid mass you'll need dynamite to separate." He wasn't being cruel. He'd helped bury 2 children the previous winter, lost to pneumonia in a cabin that had run out of dry firewood during a 3-day blow. He knew the stakes. Margaret drove the pickaxe into the earth again. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Mackenzie. Truly. But I've thought this through." She'd excavated a space 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 4 feet deep. The north wall, the one that had faced the prevailing winter winds, she'd dug into the natural slope of the land, giving her 5 feet of earth as insulation. The south wall, facing her cabin, stood only 3 feet below grade. She'd lined the bottom with 6 inches of creek gravel she'd hauled in a borrowed wagon, 27 loads over 3 days. Drainage, she'd explained to anyone who asked. Moisture goes down, not up. The framework went up in 4 days. She'd used the railroad timber for corner posts, 8-inch square pieces of pine that the survey crew had deemed too split for their purposes, but perfectly sound for hers. She'd paid $50 per post to the foreman, who'd been happy to sell off scrap. The walls she'd built from cottonwood logs, each one stripped of bark and notched to fit tight. No chinking needed. The roof was the clever part. Reverend Peter Haugen from the Lutheran Church in Pembina visited her claim on a Sunday in late September, ostensibly to invite her to services but really to see what the Swedish widow was building. Haugen was Norwegian, had been a ship's carpenter before he'd found God in the ministry, and he understood construction. He stood looking at her roof framework for a long time before he spoke. "You're building it backwards." The roof angled down from south to north, sloping toward the excavated bank. Most structures had roofs that peaked in the center or sloped away from the weather. This one seemed designed to catch snow and funnel it toward the back. "Not backwards," Margaret said. "Intentional." She'd covered the roof framework with split cottonwood shingles, overlapped like fish scales. Over that, a layer of birch bark she'd peeled from fallen trees along the river. Over that, 8 inches of sod, the same kind she'd used for her cabin. The whole thing angled down at roughly 15 degrees. Snow piles up on the sod roof, adds insulation, 8, 10, 12 inches of snow on top of 8 inches of sod on top of bark. That's 2 feet of protection from the cold. And the angle means the heat from inside, what little there is, rises and melts the bottom layer of snow just enough to create an ice seal. Keeps wind from getting through the gaps. Haugen frowned. "Heat from inside? It's a firewood bunker, Mrs. Lindholm. There's no stove in there." She'd looked at him with those pale blue eyes that seemed to calculate trajectories invisible to other people. "The wood itself generates heat as it settles and dries. Not much, but some. And the earth around the structure stays warmer than the air above it, even in January. 40 degrees warmer sometimes. That heat transfers through the logs. If you're watching this because you value the kind of practical frontier wisdom that kept our ancestors alive in conditions that'd kill most modern folks within 24 hours, hit that like button. This story gets into technical territory that most history books skip right over, and I need to know there's an audience for preserving these details before YouTube decides frontier knowledge isn't worth recommending. The door was the final detail that separated skeptics from believers. Margaret had positioned it on the south wall, the wall closest to her cabin, and she'd built it in 2 layers. The outer door was solid cottonwood planks, 4 inches thick, hung on hinges she'd bought from Granholm for 30 cents. It opened outward, away from the interior. The inner door, separated from the outer by an 18-inch gap, was lighter, 2-inch planks, and opened inward. The gap between the doors created an airlock. "Same principle as a ship's hold," she'd explained to Reverend Haugen. 2 barriers against the weather, with dead airspace between. Keeps the cold from penetrating. The total cost, tallied up in her account book in neat Swedish script, came to $7.40. Railroad timber, $2. Nails and hardware, 90 cents. Hinges, 30 cents. Cottonwood logs, free, if you didn't count labor. Creek gravel, free. Sod and bark, free. And every homesteader who saw it predicted failure. Anna Bjornstad, a widow herself who'd survived 6 Dakota winters, made the trip from her claim 8 miles northeast specifically to talk Margaret out of trusting the bunker. This was in early October, with the structure complete and Margaret beginning to stack cordwood inside. Anna was 63 years old, had buried a husband and 2 sons on the frontier, and her opinions carried the weight of survival. "Margaret, listen to me. I've seen every kind of winter shelter there is. Dugouts, soddies, log cabins, even a stone house over by Cavalier. And I'm telling you, putting your firewood underground is asking for trouble. The moisture alone will ruin half your fuel. And if we get a real storm, the kind that piles snow to the eaves, you won't be able to reach that door. You'll be trapped in your cabin with no way to get to your wood." Margaret had paused in her stacking. She'd split and stored 7 cords of cottonwood and ash, each piece cut to 18-inch lengths, each one stacked with gaps for air circulation. The interior of the bunker stayed remarkably dry. The gravel floor drained perfectly. The log walls, chinked with nothing but their own tight fit, somehow kept moisture out while letting just enough air circulate to prevent mold. "Mrs. Bjornstad, I've walked the path from my cabin door to the bunker door 50 times in the past week, memorizing every step. 32 feet, 41 paces for me. I could walk it blind, and I've strung a rope from my door latch to the bunker door latch, anchored at both ends. Storm comes, I follow the rope. Anna had shaken her head. And what about when the temperature drops to 40 below, 50 below? When the wind's moving so fast it'll freeze exposed skin in 2 minutes? You planning to make that walk every few hours to keep your fire going? Margaret had just smiled. I've planned for that too. Inside her cabin, she'd built a wood box. Not unusual. Most homesteaders kept a day's worth of fuel inside. But Margaret's wood box was different. It held 3 days of firewood, stacked floor to ceiling along the north wall. 72 pieces, each one calculated to burn for exactly 2 hours in her small sheet metal stove. At her normal burn rate, 3 pieces per day in moderate cold, 5 pieces in severe cold, she could survive 3 days without leaving her cabin. I go out to the bunker once every 3 days in normal weather, she'd told Anna. Load up the wood box, check the bunker for any issues, and get back inside. If a storm hits, I can wait it out. Anna Bjornstad had looked at the wood box, at the rope visible through the window, at Margaret's calm face, and something in her expression had softened. You know what you remind me of? My mother. She came to Minnesota Territory in 1851, long before there was any civilization to speak of. People told her she was doing everything wrong, too. She survived 34 winters. Anna had gripped Margaret's hand. I hope you survive just as many. But I still think you're taking an unnecessary risk. October passed. Margaret made her last trip to Pembina on the 28th, stocking up on flour, salt pork, and kerosene. Thomas Granholm noted in his ledger that she'd bought 40 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of salt pork, 10 pounds of beans, 5 pounds of coffee, and 2 gallons of kerosene. You planning to hibernate like a bear, Mrs. Lindholm? She'd counted out her money, $3.60, leaving her with $1.15 to her name. Planning to be prepared, Mr. Granholm. My grandfather taught me that winter doesn't negotiate. The first real snow came on November 3rd, 6 inches overnight. Margaret tested her system. She'd strung the rope 3 days earlier, a 3/4-inch hemp line that ran from her door through 2 anchor posts to the bunker door. She waited until the wind picked up, until the snow was moving horizontally across her claim, and then she'd bundled up and made the walk. 32 feet, 41 paces. The rope stayed taut. She'd loaded 24 pieces of firewood into the canvas sling she'd sewn for this purpose, secured the bunker doors, and returned. Total time outside, 4 minutes. The wood was bone dry, exactly as she'd predicted. James Mackenzie, the Scots-Irish farmer who'd predicted rot and disaster, stopped by in mid-November during a brief warm spell. The temperature had climbed to 32 degrees, and he'd been checking his fences when curiosity got the better of him. How's your underground firewood grave doing, Mrs. Lindholm? There was no malice in the question, just genuine interest. Margaret invited him to see for himself. She opened both bunker doors, and Mackenzie stepped into the space she'd created. The temperature inside measured 44 degrees, 12 degrees warmer than the outside air. The firewood stacked against the walls showed no signs of moisture, no mold, no rot. The gravel floor was dry. The air smelled of wood and earth, not of decay. Mackenzie had run his hand along the logs, checking for condensation. Nothing. He'd picked up a piece of firewood from the nearest stack, examined it, even tried to bend it to check for water saturation. It was seasoned perfectly, dry as bone. I'll be damned. He'd looked at Margaret with a different expression than before. You know what you've built here? You've built a Swedish root cellar for firewood. I didn't think it'd work, but you've proven me wrong. What Margaret had understood, what her grandfather had taught her in the old country, was that the earth itself maintains a relatively constant temperature once you get below the frost line. In Dakota Territory, the frost line ran about 5 feet deep. Margaret's bunker, with its north wall buried 5 feet into the earth and its floor 4 feet below grade, tapped into that stable temperature. The earth around the structure stayed between 40 and 45 degrees year-round. That warmth, minimal as it was, kept moisture from condensing on the firewood. The gravel drainage kept groundwater from seeping up. The double door system kept cold air from penetrating during access. And the sod roof, which would soon be buried under feet of snow, created an insulation barrier that'd make a modern engineer nod in appreciation. But understanding the principles and surviving their test are two different things. The blizzard came on February 9th, 1881. The barometric pressure had been dropping for 2 days, and every animal on the prairie knew something was coming. Margaret's chickens, normally content to scratch in the lean-to she'd built against her cabin's south wall, had gone quiet and huddled. The sky at dawn was pale and flat, the kind of colorless expanse that made experienced homesteaders check their fuel supplies. Margaret had made her routine trip to the bunker the evening before, loading her indoor wood box completely. 72 pieces, 3 days of fuel at moderate burn, less if the cold got severe. She'd also brought in an extra armload, 20 pieces stacked beside the door, just in case. Call it 4 days of fuel if she was careful. The wind arrived at 8 in the morning, from the northeast first. Not the prevailing direction. That should have been the warning. By 9 it had shifted to come from the south as well. By 10, the temperature had dropped from 8 above to 2 below, a 10-degree fall in 2 hours. By noon, the wind was hitting her cabin from 3 directions simultaneously, a phenomenon that occurred when low-pressure systems collided over the plains. The snow came horizontal, then vertical, then from angles that seemed to defy physics. Margaret stood at her window, watching her world disappear. The ridgeline to the northwest, normally visible as a dark line against the sky, was gone. The cottonwoods along the river, 600 yards south, were gone. Her outhouse, 30 feet from her door, was a vague shape that appeared and disappeared in the white chaos. The rope to her bunker, that 3/4-inch hemp lifeline, was still visible, but barely. It moved in the wind like a living thing, snow building up on the windward side until it looked like a white snake suspended in the air. The temperature, measured by the alcohol thermometer she kept outside her south window, read 14 below zero at 2 in the afternoon. By 4, it was 22 below. By 6, when the light had faded to a gray murk that wasn't quite day and wasn't quite night, it was 28 below. And the wind never stopped. 40 miles per hour, sustained, with gusts that hit 60. The wind chill, a concept that wouldn't be formally calculated until the 1940s, was somewhere around 70 below zero. This is the kind of storm that killed people. Not slowly, not mercifully, quickly. A man could leave his cabin to check on livestock and be dead in 15 minutes, frozen solid 30 feet from his door, disoriented by the white confusion, unable to find his way back. Margaret fed her stove, 3 pieces at a time now, with the cold driving through every gap in her soddy's walls. The interior temperature, normally around 55 degrees with a moderate fire, had dropped to 43. She wore her wool coat, her hat, her mittens, and still felt the cold working its way into her bones. The stove glowed red, consuming fuel faster than she'd calculated. At this rate, her 4-day supply would last less than 2. Are you starting to understand what our ancestors dealt with? The kind of cold that doesn't just make you uncomfortable but actively tries to kill you? If you want to see more stories about how frontier families survived conditions that had shut down modern civilization, subscribe to this channel. We're documenting knowledge that's disappearing from living memory, and every subscription tells YouTube that frontier history matters. The first night was endurable, barely. Margaret slept in intervals, waking every 2 hours to feed the stove. The wind screamed around her soddy with a sound like tearing metal. Snow found its way through gaps she didn't know existed, creating small drifts along the north wall inside her cabin. The temperature inside had stabilized at 38 degrees. Outside, it hit 34 below. The wood box was half empty when dawn arrived, or what passed for dawn. The storm hadn't weakened. If anything, it had intensified. She'd burned through 2 days of firewood in 18 hours. Margaret stood at her south window, looking at the rope. It was still there, barely visible, now coated in ice and snow, until it looked like a horizontal icicle. The bunker was 32 feet away. 41 paces. She'd walked it dozens of times. She knew every step. But she'd never walked it in 70 below wind chill, never walked it in whiteout conditions where visibility measured in feet rather than yards. She looked at her indoor wood supply. Maybe 36 hours of fuel left, maybe less if the temperature kept dropping. She had a decision to make. Wait and hope the storm broke before her fuel ran out, or make the walk now while she still had enough warmth in her cabin to recover if something went wrong. James Mackenzie had asked her once what she'd do if she got disoriented during a storm, if the rope broke or she lost her grip. She'd answered honestly, "I'd die." The frontier didn't offer second chances to people who made mistakes in blizzard conditions, but her grandfather's voice was in her head, speaking Swedish words she'd heard throughout her childhood. Förberedelse är överlevnad. Preparation is survival. She'd built the bunker for exactly this situation. She'd strung the rope for exactly this situation. She'd practiced the walk for exactly this situation. Waiting wasn't preparation. It was hope disguised as caution. She dressed in layers. Wool underwear, wool dress, wool coat, wool scarf wrapped around her face, wool mittens over thin gloves, felt boots with wool socks. She tied a rope around her waist, anchored the other end to her stove, a backup in case the primary rope failed. She grabbed the canvas sling she'd sewn, and she opened her door. The wind hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't air, it was a solid thing that wanted her dead. The temperature on her skin went from bearable to burning in seconds. She gripped the rope with both hands, mittens already growing stiff from the cold, and started walking. 1 pace, 2, 3. The wind tried to push her sideways north, away from the bunker. She leaned into it, trusting the rope. 4, 5, 6. She couldn't see the bunker. She couldn't see her own hands on the rope. The world was white noise and screaming wind. 7, 8, 9. Her face hurt, not cold, not uncomfortable. Hurt, like someone was driving nails through her cheeks. Her eyes watered and the tears froze on her eyelashes immediately. 10, 11, 12. She'd practiced this blind. She knew the count. 32 feet, 41 paces. She was barely a third of the way there. 13, 14. Her breathing was loud inside the scarf wrapped around her face, loud and harsh and frightened. 15, 16. She stumbled on something. A drift, a frozen ridge of snow. Something. She caught herself on the rope, felt it bite into her palm even through the mittens. 17, 18. Don't stop. If you stop, you'll freeze. 19, 20. The cold was working through her layers now, finding the gaps, the spaces between fabric and skin. 21, 22, 23. Halfway. She should be halfway. The wind shifted, came from behind her now, tried to push her forward too fast. She slowed her pace, kept her grip tight. 24, 25. Her hands were numb. She couldn't feel the rope anymore, could only trust that her frozen fingers were still gripping it. 26, 27, 28. She saw the bunker door, just a shape in the white chaos, but it was there. 29, 30, 31. She reached for the door latch with hands that no longer felt like hands. The metal burned with cold. She'd wrapped the latch in cloth before the storm, knowing this might happen. She pulled. The outer door opened. She stumbled into the 18-inch gap between doors. The wind dropped by half. She pulled the outer door shut behind her, and the screaming stopped. The silence was shocking. She stood in the small space between the doors, breathing hard, her face on fire with returning circulation. She could hear the wind outside, but it was distant now, muffled by 4 inches of wood and 18 inches of trapped air. She reached for the inner door latch. Her hands wouldn't work properly. She had to use both mittened hands to grip the latch, pulling with her whole body weight. The inner door opened. Warm air hit her. Warm being relative, probably 45 degrees, but after 70 below, it felt like stepping into summer. The bunker interior was dark except for what little gray light penetrated through gaps around the doors. But she knew this space. She'd stacked every piece of wood herself. She felt her way to the nearest stack, loaded the canvas sling. 20 pieces, 40, 60. The sling was heavy now, pulling at her shoulders. She secured it, turned back to the door. The return trip was harder. The sling threw off her balance and the wind had shifted again. She counted her paces, gripping the rope with both hands, the sling bouncing against her back. The cold found her faster this time. She'd warmed up in the bunker, and now her body heat was leaking away at an accelerated rate. 15 paces, 20, 30. She couldn't feel her feet. 35, 40. Her cabin door should be right in front of her. She couldn't see it. Panic hit. She'd counted 41 paces. The door should be here, but there was nothing but white wind and snow. She pulled on the rope, felt resistance. She was at the end of her tether, literally. The backup rope around her waist was pulling tight. The cabin was here, somewhere. She reached out with one hand, keeping the other on the rope, and felt for the wall. Wood. Rough cottonwood bark. She was touching her cabin. She slid her hand along the wall, found the door frame, found the latch. The door opened. She fell inside, kicked the door shut, and collapsed. The canvas sling spilled firewood across her floor. She lay there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, feeling life come back into her extremities with the kind of pain that made her gasp. Her fingers, her toes, her face. Everything hurt. Everything burned. But she was alive, and she had fuel. The blizzard lasted 3 more days. Margaret made the walk to the bunker 4 more times. Each trip a calculated risk, each trip successful. The rope held. The bunker doors held. The firewood stayed dry, stayed accessible, stayed exactly where she'd stored it. By the 4th day, when the wind finally dropped and the sky cleared to a heartbreaking blue, the temperature stood at 41 below zero. Without wind, the cold was almost peaceful. She emerged from her cabin on the 5th day to a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted to the roofline on the north side of her soddy. The bunker was completely buried except for a small depression where the south-facing door sat. The rope, her lifeline, was frozen solid in the air, a sculpture of ice and hemp that wouldn't thaw until April. And she was alive. James Mackenzie was the first to check on her, riding over from his claim on the 6th day. He'd lost 4 chickens and a milk cow to the cold, and he'd burned through his entire woodshed supply just keeping his family from freezing. He found Margaret outside her cabin, digging out her bunker door with a shovel. "Mrs. Lindholm." His voice carried relief and something else. Respect, maybe. "I'm glad to see you made it through." She'd paused in her digging, leaned on the shovel. The bunker worked. He'd dismounted, walked to where he could see the rope still frozen in the air, walked to where he could see the partially excavated bunker door. "How many times did you make the walk?" She'd considered. 5 times, once the day before it hit, 4 times during the storm. Mackenzie had just shook his head. "In my professional opinion, Mrs. Lindholm, anyone who makes that walk even once in those conditions is either crazy or the bravest person in Dakota territory." I'm leaning toward the latter. Word spread. Within 2 weeks, 7 different homesteaders visited Margaret's claim to see the bunker. Thomas Granholm made the trip from Pembina with 50 pounds of flour and 5 pounds of coffee. No charge. Consider it a gift from someone who didn't believe you knew what you were doing. Anna Bjornstad came in March. She'd walked the bunker's interior, examined the construction, touched the dry firewood. "I thought you were being foolish. Turns out you were being Swedish." The bunker served her for 11 more years. She survived 7 more major blizzards, including the catastrophic March 1888 storms that killed over 400 people across the plains. By then, her design had been copied by 18 different homesteaders in Pembina County alone. Some built larger versions, some smaller, some added refinements Margaret hadn't considered. But they all shared the same fundamental insight. The earth protects what you put inside it, if you understand how the earth works. Margaret married Norwegian farmer Olaf Stensrud in 1889, combined their claims into 320 acres, and raised 4 children who all survived to adulthood, remarkable for that era. She died in 1923 at 72, having outlived most of her critics. The bunker outlasted her. When the property sold in 1931, the new owners found the structure still intact, still functional, the firewood inside still dry and ready to burn. Modern engineers would recognize what Margaret built. She'd created what's now called an earth-sheltered structure with passive thermal regulation and moisture management through capillary drainage. The double-door airlock appears in contemporary cold climate building codes. The sod roof, designed to accumulate insulating snow while creating an ice seal, mimics principles used in current Scandinavian architecture. She'd calculated thermal mass transfer, wind load distribution, and seasonal freeze-thaw cycles without formal training. But she'd had something more valuable than formal training. She'd had accumulated wisdom from generations who'd survived climates that didn't forgive mistakes, combined with practical intelligence to adapt those principles to a new landscape. Her grandfather's root cellars in Sweden stored potatoes in soil frozen 8 months a year. Margaret looked at Dakota territory and saw the same principles waiting to be applied. The exact location of her claim is difficult to pinpoint today. Pembina County has been subdivided repeatedly, and many original homestead records were lost in a courthouse fire in 1937. But local historians believe her quarter section sat approximately 4 miles northwest of modern Pembina, where the Tongue River bends east. The cottonwoods are gone. The soddy collapsed back into earth decades ago. But somewhere under those fields, there's probably still a depression in the ground, 8 feet by 12 feet, where a Swedish widow proved that $7.40, combined with knowledge and courage, could mean the difference between life and death. The skeptics she'd faced, Granholm, Mackenzie, Bjornstad, Haugen, they'd all come from legitimate places. They'd seen people die from bad decisions on the frontier. Their doubt wasn't malice, it was experience. And when Margaret proved them wrong, they learned. They adapted. They copied her design. That willingness to update beliefs in the face of new evidence is its own form of frontier wisdom. If there's a modern application to this story, it's this. Solutions to extreme conditions often come from people who've faced them before, just in different contexts. Margaret's grandfather had never seen Dakota territory, never experienced a Great Plains blizzard. But he'd understood that cold and moisture and earth follow the same physical laws regardless of geography. There's also something to be said for redundancy. Margaret didn't just build a bunker. She built one with drainage, insulation, double doors, a rope system, a backup rope, an indoor wood box, calculated fuel reserves. She'd layered her preparations because she understood that survival in extreme conditions requires multiple fallback positions. Modern emergency management calls this defense in depth. Margaret Lindholm called it common sense. The $7 figure wasn't really the point. The point was resourcefulness, using what was available rather than waiting for ideal resources. Railroad scrap, river gravel, salvaged hinges. She'd built a survival system from materials other people had overlooked. If you've stayed with this story to the end, if you value detailed historical knowledge about how real people solved real problems with practical engineering and courage, please subscribe. We're fighting an algorithm that prefers flashy thumbnails over documented frontier history. Every subscription helps prove there's an audience for preserving these stories. Margaret Lindholm probably never imagined her Firewood bunker would be discussed 140-plus years later. She'd built it to solve an immediate problem, staying alive through Dakota winters on a widow's budget. But in doing so, she demonstrated principles that remain relevant. Prepare before the crisis. Learn from people who've faced similar challenges. Use the resources you have. Layer your defenses. And when people doubt you, if your reasoning is sound and your preparation is thorough, prove them wrong through results, not arguments. The frontier is gone. The last homesteads were claimed in the 1970s. But the principles that kept people like Margaret Lindholm alive in impossible conditions don't expire. They wait, stored like firewood in a bunker, ready when the next storm arrives. And the storm always arrives eventually. The only question is whether you'll be prepared when it does.